The type of water a fish lives in will make a big impact on its behavior and what it eats. But why does that matter to you? Well, the more you know about a fish's environment, the fewer frustrations you'll run into out on the water. You can avoid those long days of randomly catching a few small fish, or those agonizing afternoons when a gorgeous hatch comes off, but every single fish refuses your fly. You just got to learn about how a fish's environment impacts all the variables that go into a day of fishing. On this episode of Untangled, we'll lay out exactly how and why knowing more about a fish's home will help you have a better day out on the water. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. But we've got an interesting topic to discuss today. As we mentioned right in the open of the show, we're going to be talking all about how where a fish lives impacts everything from its behavior to what that fish eats. And this is something that I don't feel like it gets discussed nearly enough, because it's something that quickly becomes second nature to those of us who spend a lot of time fishing, or just who have been doing this for long enough, where we say, oh, I'm going to go out and I'm going to fish this river today, so I know I'm going to need to grab these flies, and you just grab them and you go, and you don't think about, well, why am I selecting these flies? That why has become internalized enough that you just go and do it. But as anybody who's listened to the show before knows, we are big on discussing the why here at VFC, and that's what we're going to do today, is the why behind your fly selection and fish behavior and how that changes from river type to river type. And fish, they will behave very differently if they're living in a freestone stream versus a spring creek. And I'll define those terms here in just a moment for those who may not be familiar with them. But just to give you an example, there's a spring creek that Alex and I love to fish. It is out in the middle of absolute nowhere. We're talking, this thing's a 5-hour drive from any kind of civilization. There's not even a McDonald's within, I think, 3 hours of this place. It is out there. And we go out there, we fish a couple of times a year. But Spring Creek, it's super clear water, slow moving, and the fish are so picky. And if you don't have the right fly, and if your presentation's just not perfect enough, you'll go home skunked. I've been skunked there before. I can't speak for Alex. I don't think he has, but I know. Well, I shouldn't say I know. I think some of the other VFC crew have been skunked out there before. It's a tough place to fish. There's big fish in there, but it's very tough to fish. And then contrast that to one of the favorite rivers I have by my place, a big Freestone. And that thing, the fish are a little pickier there, but once you figure out where they're at and where they're holding for the day, it really is kind of game on. You can just put quite a few nice fish in the net. They're much more willing to eat a fly, especially if it doesn't have the best presentation. And that is the reason for that big behavior difference comes down to the type of water that they live in. So that's what we're going to dive into, so that you can know before you head out somewhere. If you know just a little bit about that place, then you can say, oh, I'm fishing a Freestone today, I should be prepared to fish it this way. Or, oh, I'm going to go hit the Spring Creek today, I need X, Y, and Z flies. So I'm going to dive into the three main types of rivers, and I'll explain what each type of it is and how that impacts fish behavior as we move through them. So hopefully you get some actionable tips and intel from each one of these. And we're going to go ahead and start with a Freestone River. So your Freestones, these are your rivers that are fed primarily by snow and rain. So snow melt is going to feed a lot of them. Rain feeds a lot of them. They'll be high early in the season, so they'll run high early on, and then they get really low late in the season, because other than rain, snow, and maybe a few tributaries, there's not a whole lot that is consistently keeping the flow of the water going throughout the year. They're also very susceptible to weather events. So if you get a lot of rain, or there was a fire and you've got some banks that aren't stable and you get a big rain, you'll see dirty water. You might even see mudslides around these places. The Freestones are very susceptible to weather events. Okay. But since the flows are sporadic, they go really high, they peak right at runoff, and then they start to come down towards the end of June, beginning of July. That's when they really start to become fishable. But since those flows are so sporadic, the insect life is a little bit limited in these freestones. You're not going to see near the variety of insect life in a freestone that you will see in a tailwater or a spring creek. There can be some great hatches on freestones, but there's just not as much diversity of bug life as you would see in other waters. That freestone by my house that I mentioned, it has a wonderful, probably the best stonefly hatch outside of what you get over on places like the Madison, those big rivers over there. This has got a phenomenal stonefly hatch, but I didn't really see much of a caddis hatch over there. There's been a little bit of midge action there in the winter, a little bit of blue wing action. I really haven't seen a whole lot of blue wings. There's a lot of drakes though, so it's just different. Where if I was on a spring creek, for example, I'd expect to see that steady progression of bugs throughout the year, and then on this freestone, I see a little bit of caddis action, a little bit of early mayfly action, and then not a whole lot. Then the stoneflies kick on, and that's when it really picks up, is when the stoneflies show up. That's the dominant hatch on this river. And with other types of rivers, that's not always the case. It will be much more seasonal. You'll have a lot more, you'll have a lot more diversity of bug life out there. But since the bug life is not as diverse, there's not as much of it, the fish are going to be more opportunistic in these fisheries as well. They have evolved. It's not that they're stupid, because a lot of the streams that we fish up in the high country, especially here in the Rockies, a lot of those are freestone rivers, and the fish in them often have this reputation for being stupid. They'll just hit anything. The brookies and the cutthroat especially are known for just hitting any dry that floats by. And part of that, yes, cutthroat are more inclined to take dry flies. That's due a lot to their evolutionary history, because they grew up for thousands of years in those high country streams where the food is limited. There's not as many bugs, and the growing season is very short too. You really only have from about, I wrote it down here just a sec, from about June to September is really your prime growing season up there. So the fish need to just pack the pounds on to make it through the winter. And in these freestones, with the cutthroat, they're going to eat as much as they can. So they're more forgiving of bad drifts and bad presentations, because they're just trying to eat. It's not that they're dumb, they're just being opportunistic. Now, that is one of the great things about a freestone stream is, generally speaking, the fish can be a little easier. It can give you faster fishing and better fishing, because the fish tend to be more forgiving of a lot of the less than good drifts. But that's not every freestone is going to be that way. Some freestones can be very tough to fish. But as the seasons progress, they're still going to follow the seasonal progression of bugs, but they're still going to be more opportunistic to take those bugs, even if your drift isn't perfect. And just to drive home that point about how they're not dumb, because I really want to make sure that's understood. They're just opportunistic. That big freestone that I just mentioned, early on in the season, they are going stonefly nymphs hard. That's all they want to eat. That is their big thing. That's the meal ticket item. That you go up there with some stonefly nymphs, you're going to have yourself a good day. That's like showing up to my house with a plate of wings and asking me to do something. I'll do whatever you want. You bring me some wings. I'm down for that. Okay. The fish feel that same way about stonefly nymphs. But let's see. What is it? November? It's November right now. You'd think I would know the dates. It's November. The last time Alex and I fished this freestone was probably September, I think. And the stoneflies were done by then, but there were still a substantial amount of drakes out and about. There were a lot of mayflies still out. And the fish had noticeably moved off of the stoneflies. They weren't taking our stonefly nymphs, but when I tied on some mayfly nymph imitations, I started getting into fish they were throwing themselves at me at that point. Okay, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it went from very difficult. Why aren't they eating the stonefly nymph? And then I said, well, maybe the stoneflies are just done. I tied on that mayfly nymph, and it started to fish like it normally did. The fish were they were more than willing to play. So there will be that seasonal change throughout the year, but the fish will still be opportunistic. Something else that you'll like about freestones is they do have more immediately noticeable features like your runs, your pockets, and your pools, and riffles especially. They've got a little bit more character to them than the tailwaters or the spring creeks. The tailwaters especially, I was just fishing one yesterday. It's big, it's a couple 100 feet wide in places, and it just looks the same. There's nothing that jumps out to you that says, hey buddy, there's a fish here. Whereas on a freestone, you can walk up to it and, oh, there's a pocket and there's a seam, and you can see it. You get excited. You know that the fish are there. That's what's really nice about freestones is they do generally reveal a bit more of their secrets that way, just by the nature of how they're built. So on a freestone, you will need a smaller amount of flies to match all the potential hatches that you've got going on. So you don't need to worry as much about your presentation either on a freestone. A good stable of trout bugs usually will just do the trick. When I'm out fishing freestones, I've just got caddis, mayflies, stoneflies, and midges. I don't really worry too much about, oh, well, I need all the life cycle stages, or I need all these emergers, or I need these soft tackles. I focus on the classic sizes, classic patterns, and that seems to do really well for me when I'm out on a freestone. Hopper dropper rigs are deadly on freestones as well. My personal favorite way to fish a lot of them from, honestly, July until the stoneflies are done is Chubby Chernobyl up top. That's my dry, and then a Pat's rubber legs beneath it. That's just a deadly combination. So that's everything you need to know about freestones. Spring creeks can be the bane of your existence, and I have certainly felt that way before. I've sworn off fishing spring creeks before. It's felt like when somebody says, oh yeah, I'll grab the wings, and they show up with boneless wings, breaded. No, you didn't get wings. You just got chicken nuggets, and now they're soggy. All right. It's felt that way sometimes on a spring creek for me. They can be really tough to fish. But spring creeks, they're fed by underground springs. That's where they get their name from. So they do have stable flows and stable water temperatures year-round, unlike freestones. This makes them incredibly fertile places. So they've got a very, very large variety of bug life. You're going to see a ton of things. You may not see very many stoneflies in spring creeks because spring creeks don't have quite the right habitat for stoneflies. Stoneflies like faster, highly oxygenated water, and you usually don't see a lot of that in a spring creek. So that might be the only bug that you don't see, but you're going to see everything else in a spring creek. They're gin clear enough. Well, one of my buddies used to say they're clear enough that you could read a newspaper laying on the bottom of the river. That's how clear they are. And they really don't have a whole lot in the way of obvious structure or water types. You look at them and it can feel like you're fishing a lazy river. That's a really good way to think about it. They're just like a big lazy river instead of an actual river. And since the water is so clear, the fish are incredibly picky about presentation. I mean, you think I'm picky about my wings? These take the picky 2-year-old that won't eat the peas unless it's doused in a gallon of mayonnaise or whatever. I don't know what 2-year-olds I don't know what 2-year-olds eat, but we hear those stories about picky kids. This takes that to a whole new level. Okay. You got to have the right fly, and it has to be presented in the perfect way, or you're probably going to be really frustrated and not catch too many fish. Now, spring creeks are being known, like we've talked about, for being tough to fish, but they are also home to some giant fish because, again, they're incredibly fertile. They grow tons of bugs, so there is no shortage of food. These fish can get super fat. You think about Silver Creek in Idaho, probably the most famous spring creek. You think about the size of some of the fish that come out of there. For those who may not know, there are some enormous fish that come out of Silver Creek every year. It's a spring creek. It's fertile. There's tons and tons of bugs, so there's no shortage for them to eat. And the nice thing about a spring creek for the fish as well is that the current's moving a lot slower. So that slower current means the fish don't have to work as hard to move around and get their food, so they can get fatter quicker. It's real convenient for them. So on a spring creek, we talked a little bit about it. What you're going to need to have success out on a spring creek, you're going to need a lot of different flies to mimic whatever the hatch might be on a given day. The hatches will progress almost like clockwork on a spring creek. You can really almost predict them to the day when, all right, the blue wings are starting. Okay, the pale morning duns are starting. Now the drakes are starting. Now the caddis are starting. Now the midges are starting. You can really see that play out. And again, because there's so many bugs in the water, the fish are going to be very focused on the life cycle stages and eating the life cycle stage that's most abundant at the moment. Okay. Remember back to our freestones, there's not as many bugs, so the fish will eat just about whatever. But on a spring creek, the fish can key in on the hatch because there might be 10,000 emerging bugs right then, and they want that instead of the nymph or instead of the adult. Okay. This is where you need your mayfly adults, your emergers, your spinners, all your different kinds of nymphs. Those become very important because you have to match the life cycle stages. Your ability to construct long leaders and make delicate presentations, that also comes into play because, again, the water is low and clear enough that it'll feel like the fish are sitting there. They'll look at your fly and they'll count the tail feathers and, oh, no, yeah, Durant used 3 tail feathers and this one only needed 2, so that's obviously a fake. It can feel that way. It's so frustrating, but it's a great place. A spring creek's a great place to go test your skills and really see where you stack up and where you need to improve. It's a great measuring stick for yourself. So even if you get your butt kicked, you can look at it and say, okay, I've got to work on X, Y, and Z, right? For me, it was the big thing. It was what really taught me the value of knowing how to fish just a single dry fly. That's what I usually fish when I'm on a spring creek. That gets me the best presentation. And then I cast individual fish that I see rising. It's almost like I'm hunting instead of just casting a big brace of nymphs out and hoping that I'll get into something like I would on a tailwater or on a freestone. And just to put this into perspective a bit, I mentioned that spring creek that Alex and I like to fish. I think the last time we fished it, I think this was the last time, we got out there early in the morning, and the fish were going nuts for chironomids, which are a big midge. And they were eating them pretty high in the water column. They were snacking on them. And we got into a few fish using chironomids. And then as the chironomid hatch petered off towards about noon, everything kind of died down for a minute. There wasn't a whole lot going on. And then the mayflies started to come off later in the afternoon. The hatches changed, and we had to switch over from chironomids. We had to switch over to the mayflies and rig up with that. And you will see that play out on spring creeks. It's very common to go from one hatch in the morning to one hatch in the evening, or for the fish to want all the adult mayflies in the morning to only wanting the spent wings or spinners or maybe the cripples later in the day. There's just going to be a lot of variation that you'll have to work through as an angler when you're out there on the water, but that's part of what makes it fun. Spring creeks can be very rewarding. They're worth the effort. They're just also a little bit of a pain in the butt. Kind of like, I don't know, probably kind of like having kids, I guess. And to wrap it up, let's look at our tailwaters. This is our last of the water type. So a tailwater, these are the rivers that flow directly beneath dams. That's where they're coming from. They've got stable flows and year-round water temps, which make them very, very predictable. These are the most predictable of all our rivers because they're going to stay the same year-round. Now, that's very similar to what we have with spring creeks. The stable flows, the stable temps mean that there are a lot of different aquatic insects hatching. You've got a lot going on. You're going to need that wide selection of flies to effectively fish throughout the year. Spring creeks and tailwaters share a lot of characteristics in common. What you run into, the difference-wise with tailwaters is usually there will be a lot more character to the river. There will be a lot more obvious structure. There will be a lot. You'll have your riffles and your runs and your pools and your pockets, whereas on a spring creek, you don't really have that. So there will be a lot more for you to play around with, a lot more for you to to look at the river and say, oh, I see a seam. I know I'm going to get a fish there. There's just more to it that'll help you feel successful, help you feel like you know what you're doing. But the downside to tailwaters is they're a little bit easier to fish. The fish aren't as picky as you'll get on a spring creek. And because they're a little bit easier to fish and they usually stay open year round, they get a ton of pressure because they also grow really big fish too. So they get a lot of pressure. So these fish know a thing or two about a thing or two. They are some of the most educated fish on the planet you're going to find are in tailwaters. You've got to have a very good presentation, very good fly selection to do well on these types of waters. So on a tailwater, you're going to need to know how to effectively get your nymphs to the right depth and how to match hatches and how to read water. Those are going to be your big skills because nymphing really is a big deal on tailwaters, more so than on a spring creek. You're going to do really well nymphing on tailwaters. There are a lot of wider variety of water types in tailwaters, so that should help you break it up, especially if it's a bigger one. That'll help you be able to break it up into smaller chunks and fish it a little bit more effectively. And just to wrap this up, the tailwaters will follow a very distinct calendar of hatches as well. That's another trait they share in common with spring creeks. And just to illustrate that point for y'all, my local tailwater I love to fish, I fished it a little bit in the spring, but I really started hitting it hard in June. And in June, the fish, they were all about eating the crawdad nymph. They wanted the little crawdads, and I caught some of my best days. I caught some really big fish. I just caught a lot of fish. It was a blast. Had a great June, July. Well, August rolls around, and that starts to change a little bit because other bugs start coming off. And then 2-3 weeks ago, I think, Alex and I were up there, and the trichos were out. And trichos are tiny, tiny little mayflies, little itty bitty things. And I was excited to get out there and fish. But with all those trichos on the water, I said, I probably ought to go with a smaller rig. So I ended up sizing everything down. I didn't fish the big flies that I normally do through the summer. I finally switched down to the smaller flies, and I ended up catching one of my best fish ever that day, actually, off of that river. So there will be that change. You'll see that progression through the year as the fish move from one food source to another. You'll see that in tailwaters as well. So just another little feather to stick in your cap there, hopefully to help you out with it. I know that it might be a little daunting to hear all this information and think, all right, well, time to memorize it, because if you're going to be successful, you got to know it all. No, you don't need to memorize all of it, okay? But you do need to be aware of it, and eventually it will become second nature. You'll know, oh, I'm going to my favorite little mountain creek today. I don't need my box of sparkle duns and comparadons and cripples and all that stuff. I'm not going to need that today. But then if you think, oh, I'm going to my tailwater today, yeah, you're going to make sure that box of flies makes it into your pack, because you might be in trouble if you don't have those flies with you when the time comes. So you will internalize it. It's worth maybe studying this information a little bit and remembering it, because this is the stuff that can help you lessen your frustrations out there in the water and really have a good time with it. So with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the opening of the show, but don't go anywhere, because just like every week, we've got the Q&A section coming right up.
Nothing is worse than hooking into a big fish only to have your knot break halfway through the fight. Setting up your rod and tying knots can be confusing and frustrating, especially if you're unsure if it's going to work. That's why we put together our Rigs and Knots Pocket Guide. It has instructions and tips on how to set up the most time-tested, proven, reliable fly fishing rigs step by step. So if you want to spend less time tinkering and more time fishing with confidence, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this guide for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we use the last half of the show to answer questions from listeners and viewers. Often the questions that you submit will become the basis for the opening part of the show as well. There's a link to submit your questions in the show notes. You can check that out. Our first question comes to us this week from Joel from Washington. Writes in and says, when choosing flies, why pick a parachute model over a non-parachute or vice versa, assuming it is the same fly? Joel, this is a really good question. Thank you for sending it in. For me, well, what it really boils down to, I guess, for a lot of people more than anything, is visibility. Excuse me. So the parachute is a lot easier to see on the water than your standard hackle dry fly. That's probably why parachutes became so popular at one point. And I know that I like to fish parachutes because they are easier to see for me as well. There are a few other reasons. I thought about this for a minute. There are a few other reasons why I would fish a parachute. It really depends on what I'm doing with the flies, what I'm trying to accomplish, and what the fish are doing. I love parachutes again for more visibility, but they also are great for fish that are being really picky about the adults that they're eating, because I think the parachutes make a little bit more lifelike silhouette on the water. They also sit a little bit lower in the water as well, and I think that might make a difference to the fish. I don't really have anything that can back that up and say, yes, for sure, it makes a difference. I'm just going off my own experience. I like fishing the parachutes because I think they look a little bit more lifelike on the water than your standard hackled flies do. But the big bushy style dry flies, they're really great in rougher water because they float well. So if I'm fishing a lot of quicker water, a lot of riffles, I'll throw one of those on, especially if I've got a dry dropper rig at that point. The parachutes aren't as good in that kind of water in my experience. But again, I really just, I tend to mostly pick parachute flies because they're easier to see. And for me, they're easier to tie. I don't know that that's necessarily the case for everybody, but I tie more parachute flies than anything else. So I've got a lot of experience with them. So they do end up feeling a lot more simple for me to tie. You might feel the opposite way. The hackled flies might be a little bit easier for you to tie just based on what you do the most of. But the biggest difference is going to be visibility. So I wouldn't worry about making the wrong choice. I don't think there's ever going to be a minute when the fish is going to turn up your Adams because it's a regular Adams and not a parachute Adams, as long as it's a match to what's out there, right? The parachute just helps you see it more. I think it just makes it a little bit easier to spot it out on the water. But thank you so much, Joel, for that question. I appreciate you sending it in. Adam from Poland has our next question. I believe this is our first submission from Poland, which is really stinking cool. So thank you, Adam. He writes in and says, how do you manage to sneak up to the fish? Because as soon as I get to the river, trout just skyrocket out of the place. Well, Adam, join the club. All right, that is, oh my goodness, I can't tell you how often I had that issue, especially early on. And we actually made an entire video about this topic. I'll link that in the show notes for anyone who wants to watch it and get a visual representation of what I'm talking about here. But the big thing to focus on, if you're fishing water where the fish are spooky, usually that's going to be water that's low and clear, because that's when the fish are going to be at their spookiest. You've got to remember that fish are very aware of overhead predators. They have great eyesight, they've got great awareness, and because they are most vulnerable to overhead predators like ospreys and eagles, they're going to be aware of anything that's big and that makes a big silhouette on the horizon. That is going to spook the fish because that triggers their fight or flight response, and we know the fish are going to take flight at that point. So when you're in that situation where the water is low and clear, and you've got to get closer, okay, you can't make a 100-foot cast to get to the fish, then you need to focus on staying low and making your movements slow and deliberate. I do a lot of crouching when I'm fishing water like this. You might see it in some of our videos in the beginner masterclass where I am crouching a lot. I spend a lot of time kneeling when I'm fishing because I'm fishing these lower, clearer waters, and I want to make sure I can get closer to the fish without spooking it. Okay, and the other side of this as well is you want to make sure that you're able to cast a reasonable distance. I think if you can get within about 20 to 30 feet of the fish and you can stay low, that 20 to 30 foot range is the sweet spot for fly casting for a lot of us. That's where most of our fly casting takes place. That's where most of our hookups happen, is in that 20 to 30 feet range, maybe out to 40, but casts beyond 40 feet are kind of few and far between when you really think about it. You're not fishing that far away from yourself. Now, on these low, clear waters, you might have to, but you should still be able to get within about 30 feet to make those casts. So I would just make sure that you can comfortably cast to that distance. So that might be something you need to work on. Go to a park and practice your casting before you get out there on the water. That might help you as well. But that 20 to 30 foot distance, that's the sweet spot. So that's not anything that's out of the ordinary. Just make sure you're able to do that. So stay low, make your movements as slow and deliberate as you can so that you don't spook the fish, and then get as close as you can to make a good cast. If you're trying to bomb 50, 60, 70 foot casts to these fish, a lot of the times that's going to spook them too, because it takes a little bit of practice when you have that much line out there and you're throwing casts that go that long. It takes a bit of practice to make sure they land softly and they don't just smack the water like a bunch of rocks hitting it. And I'm speaking from experience. That's something I still struggle with to this day. I really have to force myself to, okay, slow down, focus on my technique, make sure I'm making all the casting movements properly. Because when you do them all correctly, the fly line's going to land softly enough. But when you've got all that line out there and you're carrying that much, it can be tough, especially for a beginner, to keep that all in mind and to not make it hit the water. That's why I say get as close as you can instead of trying to cast from further back. So hopefully that helps, but I appreciate you sending that question on in. Chris from Colorado has got our next question, writes in and says, what are your top 3 go-to flies for beginners who are learning to tie? This is a great question, Chris. Thank you. I think my personal 3, and these are probably different. I think Alex, he and I were talking before at the show today. I think he would have picked a few different ones maybe. But my 3 are going to be a zebra midge, any egg pattern, and an elk hair caddis. I think these 3 are great for beginners because they're going to help build the skills you need to tie every other fly, including streamers. They're going to help you learn how to work with the materials, how to use your thread. If you have a rotary vise, you'll learn how to use that. All the foundational skills you need to know to be a good fly tyer, you're going to learn from these 3 flies. With the zebra midge, you're going to learn how to put a bead on a hook. That's one thing. You're going to learn a lot about thread and building tapers with the thread and how the thread works to make it lay flat. You're also going to learn about attaching material and then wrapping that material onto the fly. Now, with a zebra midge, you're just doing wire, which is the easiest one to work with, but it's going to teach you all the basic fundamentals of how to do that. Okay. An egg pattern, I put that in here because they're so simple. They're so easy. It's something you can tie. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then you can go out and catch fish on it pretty quickly. So that's why I think an egg's good. It's a good quick win for tyers who want to see some results right off the bat. You can tie up some eggs and do pretty well for yourself. Now, the elk hair caddis, that definitely is a tougher fly, but you're going to learn how to work with the hair. You're going to learn how to work with hackle and dubbing as well. Hair, hackle, dubbing, those are the ingredients for just about every single fly out there. So learning to work with those flies, if you can get an elk hair caddis down and make it look good and you're comfortable with it, you're going to be able to tie just about any other fly that you need to. So that's why I'd start with those 3. But thank you, Chris. I appreciate the question. Logan from Utah's got our next question, writes in and says, hey, Spencer, thank you for making this podcast. I've caught more fish because of it. My question is about dry flies. I seem to be missing a lot of hook sets on fish that take my fly. I'm not sure if I'm setting the hook too slow or too fast. Is missing the hook set just a part of dry fly fishing, or should you not be missing many on the hook set? Also, I don't think Dr. Pepper Zero gets the love it deserves on this podcast. Well, Logan, I won't argue with you on the Dr. Pepper Zero. Diet Coke's just better. But Dr. Pepper Zero is really good. What we really need back is that Dr. Pepper 10. That stuff was amazing, and I don't know what happened to it. So it's a crime that ain't here anymore. Well, anyways, I appreciate the kind words about the podcast. Thank you so much. Missing fish is part of dry fly fishing. But if you feel like you're missing too many, then there probably is an issue with it. You're not going to hook every fish that eats a dry fly. Sometimes the fish come up and they refuse it at the last second, and it will look like a rise, but it's not. So that can be something that you might be experiencing. And then sometimes the fish miss the fly. That's very rare, but it does happen. A lot of the times, though, it's an us problem, right? We're doing something wrong, and we got to fix it, okay? Usually, for me, my problem is I'm setting the hook too fast. So I've always got to remind myself, slow down. There's no competition here. I'm not going to win more wings just because I catch more fish quickly or whatever. There's nothing going on like that for me here. But a little troubleshooting for you. If a fish rises and you set the hook and you don't feel the fish at all, you feel nothing. You just set the hook and there's no resistance. That's a sign you probably set the hook a little too fast. Then if you set the hook and you feel the fish for a second, maybe you feel it wiggle, it shakes its head, but then the hook pops free or your line snaps, that means you set the hook too late, okay? My best advice is to watch the fish, and then you want to set accordingly to how the fish come up and act. So if you get a quick, splashy rise, you should set the hook quickly as soon as you see your fly disappear. If the fish is slow moving, though, and the rise is really soft and quiet, then I would set the hook only after you've watched that fish slip back below the surface. Give you an example of this. One of my favorite rivers to fish, the fish out there are notorious for taking forever to eat your fly. You could literally have yourself a 3-course lunch out there while the fish eat your fly. It's ridiculous. They take forever. It's like waiting for your wife to get ready to go anywhere. We ready to go, darling? Yeah, I'll be 10 minutes. And 20 minutes later, oh, it'll be 10 minutes. Okay, thanks. It feels like that sometimes. So the first time I really got into a good dry fly hatch out on that river, I kept breaking fish off because I was setting so fast and missing fish left and right because I was just yanking the fly right out of their mouths. Whereas instead, what I should have been doing is waiting for the fish to come up, watch its head come up, eat the fly, and then when its head dipped back down is when I should have been just going and lifting to set the rod. And that's when you know you've done it right. Okay, at that point, when you see the fish go down and you just lift to set. There would be one other thing to tell you as well. If you're using your whole body to set the hook, if you notice that you're twisting as you set the hook, you're twisting your hips and you're pulling back really hard, you might just be yanking that fly out of their mouths. At that point, I definitely recommend focusing on making your hook set just a delicate, well, not delicate, that's the wrong word, a purposeful but not hard lift. You just want to keep tension on the line, lift with purpose, but don't jerk it or yank it. Just lift with purpose, and then that should help you miss fewer fish, because if you're pulling your whole body into it, you're actually yanking that fly out of the fish's mouth before it can even get in there. So just another thing to think about. I appreciate that question, Logan. And with that, folks, we are done with the Q&A section for this week's show, but don't go anywhere. We've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. We like to highlight everybody here at VFC, and the Live Real Life moment is our chance to do just that every single week. We end the show with this moment where we share pictures and stories. We'll even share videos from folks in the community who are out there fishing and living real life. So if you've got an experience about your time on the water you'd like to share with us, there is a link to submit those in the show notes. I would love to get more of them from you. I love hearing the stories and seeing what all y'all are up to. So make sure you're sending those Live Real Life moments into us. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from George. Hi, Spencer. I wanted to share my real life experience with you. I somewhat recently came across your YouTube channel, binge watched the Fly Fishing Masterclass and a good chunk of the podcast, and decided to order the Ultimate Fly Collection. Fast forward a few weeks and my flies have arrived, and I've secured a kitchen pass from the wife as I was dying to get out and give my new knowledge and gear a shot. I finally get my chance to head to my favorite mountain creek, and after a short hike, come across a juicy looking pool with a few nice fish actively feeding. I immediately turned to the Ventures Flyco flies, tied on a brown rubber legs, and the first cast, the king of the pool swam right up and took it. Thanks for everything, Spencer, and I'm happy I got the chance to share my real life experience with you. Man, George, that's awesome. That is cool. That's what it's all about. Alex and I talked about this on episode 100. Someone wrote in and said, what's your goal with the show for the next 100 episodes? And we talked about wanting to get more stories exactly like this, because that's the whole point. of VFC is we want everybody to have George's experience out there. And George, that's awesome. You get out there, your first chance, it sounds like you got out there, you got into fish. That's awesome. You know how long I fished the first time with a fly rod before I caught anything? It's a long time. I don't know the exact number. I'd have to really think about it, but it was a long daggum time. So the fact that you got out there and did it, man, that's spectacular. Tip my hat to you. Thanks for sending that story in. Appreciate it. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up the show this week. Thank you so much for being with us. I love getting to do the show every week. I love hearing from y'all. And you're the reason we get to keep doing the show. So please keep listening. And if you haven't already, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you're listening to the show. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we are able to reach and help have a great time out on the water, which is what we're all about. Again, if you've got questions or live real life moments you'd like to share with us, there are links to submit those in the show notes. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, have some fun, and live real life.